All right. Welcome, everyone. Let me share my slides and let's start talking about anxiety in the classroom, which is like frighteningly one of my favorite things to talk about, anxiety. I know that's totally weird, but there you go. That, and you know what else I love to talk about? PowerPoint, because I made these slides with a new version of PowerPoint. And there are probably a couple of you who have been around the world long enough to remember when PowerPoint was just like, you know, a white slide with a black line and black letters. And now I'm amazed. If you're looking for good in the world or something to be happy about, go play with PowerPoint because it's such a new and amazing world that, you know, we can do all these things. So I am hearing somebody with some background noise. So if any of you guys who aren't muted, who might have some background noise, if you could mute yourself, I would totally appreciate that. So let's jump in. What is the most common psychiatric disorder among children, kids, teenagers, and actually adults too? I think you guys could answer this question for me. It is not ADHD. We think it is because that is what everyone has talked about for the last 20 years. We've heard nothing but ADHD. It is actually not autism spectrum disorder, another one that we hear about all the time. It is not depression, it's anxiety. Depending on what research you look at, it's between 15 to 30% of youth who will, and that's the tricky thing about this statistic when I read it. It doesn't say might, it doesn't say could. It says we can expect that 15 to 30% of the kids that you guys deal with every single day in the classroom will experience an anxiety disorder by the time that they are 18. So just to clarify what that means, that does talk about disorder. So what is a disorder? A disorder is when a mental health professional looks at a person, a child or an adult, and uses some very specific criteria. And in general, what they're looking for is if the anxiety is very severe, if it lasts for a really long time, if it occurs often, and here's the big one, is it disruptive to that person's life or to their family's life? Is it keeping that child from doing things that they want to do, need to do, wish they could do? So if it's disrupting their life, that's when we start to say this is actually a disorder. It's not just a normal occurrence. So it's hard to talk about anxiety without talking about the brain. And I probably like to talk about the brain even more than I like to talk about how much I love PowerPoint, because I'm sort of a geek that way. But I'm not going to go into super detail. I'm going to give you the very the very basic idea of what is going on in our brain when any of us struggle with anxiety. So we have these amazing brains that do all these amazing things, and they have lots of different specialized parts. And one part of our brain is the limbic part of our brain. I call it the lizard brain. It's the amygdala is kind of the central part of the limbic system. And basically, that part of our brain, our lizard brain, is a very prehistoric, ancient gift from evolution that we have in our brain, and it has been with us since the dawn of our species, when early humans were wandering around a jungle somewhere, and they needed to find food. They had to eat or be eaten, basically. This part of our brain was very crucial in just keeping us alive. This is the part of our brain. This is where the term fight, flight, or freeze, this is the home of fight, flight, or freeze. So when we were wandering around in that jungle, looking for something to eat, and we came across that hungry lion who also was looking for something to eat, this part of our brain very efficiently, it's like an amazing system that when you understand all the stuff it does, you can't help but have some appreciation for just how awesome this system is. I mean, it works instantaneously, and it kept our ancestors alive. It said, you either need to fight that lion, you need to run away from that lion, or you got to hide, you better freeze. And it didn't give us all kinds of, complicated options. It gave us very simple options, and it controls almost every system in our body so that we're able to do that. It changes the way we breathe. It changes the way our heart is pumping blood. It changes the way our skin is excreting sweat. It changes our digestive system, the way we're digesting food. It dilates our pupils. Just think about just about everything that you've got going on in your body. When this system is triggered, it takes over everything, and you don't have to think about it. It just does it. So it's an amazing, beautiful system that has been with us forever. I always argue, especially when I'm talking, I do some talks with teenagers, because if you want to be around people who are anxious, go spend time with teenagers. And I tell them, this is a gift. It's an evolutionary gift that had your ancestors not had this system in place and it didn't work well, they would have been eaten by the lion. They would not have lived long enough to become your ancestor, and we would not be here. So anxiety in our brain is kind of this amazing thing. So here's the way that I like to talk about. So I just said 15 to 30%. So when you're looking at your classroom, if you're looking, it may be 1 out of 5 kids, it may be 1 out of 3 kids. But in every single class that you've ever taught, I feel confident you have had more than one child who struggle with anxiety. And that's terrible. It is life disrupting. I showed you those criteria that mental health professionals use to say this is a person who has an anxiety disorder. And it's, they're not able to do things they want to do. So when I say 1 out of 5, 1 out of 3 may have a disorder, 100% of humans, every single one of us will experience anxiety at some point or another. So that's a really important point that I try and make in every single talk I give, because what we don't want is we don't want people who experience anxiety, as I just said, every single one of us will, to suddenly come to the conclusion, this means something is terribly wrong with me. It is a normal part of being human. So I do like to try and set a baseline. It's bad. It's hard to deal with. It's a struggle. And it's a normal part of being human that we all will experience at some point in our lives to different degrees, but everybody feels anxiety. So when it comes to identifying if every single kid is going to feel anxious at some point, what are some things that you should look for in the classroom that might say, this is beyond just the normal. This might be something that should be checked out by a pediatrician or a mental health professional. Rituals. So when you see kids, and they're not going to say, hey, I have to do this, I have to count an odd number before I'll sit in my desk. They aren't going to tell you. These are things you just kind of notice. Notice the kids that have some interesting little things that they do, some quirky things. If they always have to go and sharpen 3 pencils before a test, if they always, are counting when they go up the stairs and counting when they go down the stairs, if they are tapping a certain way, if they little odd, which sometimes they have to sit down and stand up a couple times before they'll sit down. It's like they do it 3 times, and always 3 times, never 4, never 5. Those are rituals, and that's a sign that they're rituals. A lot of times are something that kids stumble across and come up with the idea that if I do this, it will alleviate my anxiety. It's usually tied to obsessive compulsive disorder, which is, the very, very, very related to anxiety. And this one, as teachers, you guys know more about this than I do. You guys have been told this all the time. It's not, when something stays the same. It's when you see the changes that you notice something might be wrong. So when a kid who's always done well suddenly isn't doing well, their grades drop, they aren't able to finish their work. That's a sign that you see a lot. Sometimes they can't turn in their homework, and when you dig into what's going on, there's this perfectionism that's creeping in, that they feel like if they can't get it perfect, they can't turn it in. Sometimes if it's not going to be perfect, they won't even start. So academic changes in academic performance sometimes point to a child that's struggling with anxiety. Attendance is a huge one. Our anxious kids don't like to go to school. They don't want to go to school. School is hard for them for 1,000 different reasons, but they miss school. They are late for school because they're struggling to get there. And when they get there, they want to go home. They are the ones that are saying, can I go call my mom? I need to check out. They're also asking to go see the nurse. And to be fair to these kids, remember what I just said about how we have this amazing system that truly is affecting everything in our body. So when these kids say they don't feel well, they really do not feel well. They really have headaches. They really have stomach aches. Sometimes they throw up. It's all real. When they say, I'm sick, I need to see the nurse, I need to check out, I need to go home. But sometimes where it's coming from is anxiety. So I would never say that a child is faking it or it's all in their head even, because it's not all in their head. It's all in their body. Once their amygdala was triggered, that amygdala took over their whole body. Another thing you'll see sometime is a kid who is normally not shy suddenly becomes shy or suddenly withdraws. Withdrawing is huge. If you are if you're working with teenagers, that's teenagers' go-to move is to withdraw, to step back, to not talk, to whatever. I actually have been getting some input from a bunch of teenagers about their anxiety and what they do, and that is the number one thing that they point to when I ask them, what do you do when you feel anxious? And they also had some really interesting things to say about, what that looks like in the classroom. And kids can't pay attention in class. So this is a tricky one. So sometimes we have all, as I said in the very first slide, ADHD has been the buzzword in classrooms for a long time. And we said a child who can't pay attention, is unable to sit still, is kicking a desk, is distracted, easily distracted. Well, that's a kid with ADHD. Well, not necessarily. Anxiety looks a lot like ADHD in a lot of kids, especially young kids. I can't tell you, I've got multiple clients right now who were referred by teachers, because teachers, we owe you a huge gift. All parents owe teachers such a huge thank you, because you guys are the ones that spot it. You see it before almost anyone. You're the ones that tell us, hey, you need to look at this. This is something I'd ask your doctor about. And what they often say is, I'd look at the ADHD. You may want to have your child assessed. And I have multiple clients whose teachers said just that. And when they went through the assessment, it wasn't ADHD. It was actually anxiety. I have one client in particular I'm thinking of right now whose daughter when she gets anxious, she cannot control her body. She climbs under things, she climbs over things. That if you just say something that makes her anxious, that's how you know that she's experiencing anxiety. She suddenly starts wiggling and climbing and unable to sit still. So it's tricky. It looks like ADHD. It looks like a lot of things, actually. So remember what I just said about fight, flight, or freeze? That is actually a clue to all the ways that anxiety shows up. So anxiety, when you have a kid who is triggered into fight, flight, or freeze, sometimes they're in fight mode. Sometimes those are those, anger. I have a lot of personal experience with a child who anxiety looks like anger. It can look like explosive outbursts. It can look like temper tantrums if they're younger. It can be the teenage version of a temper tantrum when they're older. But anxiety is often a big explosive outburst, a verbal outburst. So that's fight. Flight, anxiety that triggers someone to want to fly. Sometimes it's literal. They literally run away. Sometimes a big one that a lot of teachers see is, can I go to the bathroom? Can I go to the bathroom? Can I go to the bathroom? And then they're feeling anxious and they need to move. They need to get out of this situation. They're feeling it overwhelming. I've just got to go somewhere, and the only place that it's okay for me to go is the bathroom. So they ask to go to the bathroom, and sometimes they stay in that bathroom for a long time because they are trying to get themselves together. They have experienced flight and they're trying to calm down. Sometimes they can't literally fly, so they have to do it figuratively by completely zoning out. Every anxious child who has gotten one of these miraculous things has learned to use it as a mechanism to escape their anxiety. When they feel anxious, you will see them do this. And that's just them trying to escape, to lose themselves in something else so that they aren't in the situation they're in and they feel less anxious, awkward, whatever. If you, again, spend time with teenagers, you will see lots of kids doing that to avoid feeling awkward feelings, really. And you can tell the difference between a kid who's just kind of messing around on their phone and a kid who's anxiously scrolling through their phone. There's an energetic difference. You can just see the difference if you pay close enough attention that this is anxiety. This is not just I'm messing around looking at, Snapchat or whatever. Sometimes they escape by doodling and drawing in class. That's one that the teenagers actually told me when I was asking. And sometimes they seem like they're staring out the window or zoning out. And it's tough because that's disruptive. It feels disrespectful as a teacher. You're there talking and you see this kid who's doodling away. But sometimes it's because they are feeling lots of big anxious feelings and they're trying to manage it by escaping. And freeze. Freeze is another one we see in our classrooms all the time. The kids that are frozen cannot make decisions. And a lot of times they're asking you for input on decisions that they're capable of making. That's a clue that it's not just your run-of-the-mill, they're asking questions. But when they start asking questions like, well, should I use a red crayon or a blue crayon? Or, things like that kind of don't matter, but that is a sign that they're getting a little anxious and they're starting to freeze. Another thing that frozen kids tend to do when they're feeling anxious is they get very concerned about getting it right and making sure they understood the instructions and making sure they understood. So actually they're going to go on one extreme or the other, your frozen kids. On one extreme, they're going to ask questions almost repeatedly and excessively, basic things that you just said. Because they're in an anxious state, they're not processing what you're saying, and they're getting more and more anxious that they're going to do it wrong because they can't process what you're saying. So they're going to be like, well, where am I supposed to write my name? Well, how many copies did you say? How many blue marks were we supposed to make? And just asking and asking and asking. And that's a sign that this is a kid that's getting anxious. The other thing that they will do is, and teachers, you know this exactly what I'm talking about. And my not even extensive experience teaching, but in a few years that I spent in the classroom, I would see this, where it is clear, you know, that child does not know what you just said, or does not understand what you're explaining, or does not understand what you've asked them to do. You know it. They haven't said a word, but you are clear, and you will say, Bobby, do you get what I'm talking about? Bobby, did you understand that? And Bobby will say, uh-huh. That's a frozen child a lot of times. That's a child that's anxious mind has taken over, and they're so anxious that they don't understand it, nor are they even able to tell you they don't understand it. So you'll see one extreme or the other when a child is getting kind of frozen by their anxiety. So what about the rest of the brain? So this is really important to understand. I told you all about the amygdala and how this efficient system that takes over your whole body and puts you into fight, flight, or freeze. What's happening to the rest of your brain? Because we have all this other stuff that we can do with these amazing human brains of ours. Well, it doesn't work very well, if at all. So that's really the worst part about this when we're talking about anxiety in the classroom. Executive functioning is out the window when a person is struggling with anxiety. They are not able to plan. They are not able to organize. They also are not able to encode information. So if they're feeling anxious while you are explaining things to them, it's not getting processed properly. They're not putting it all into their memory as well as they would when they're in a calm state. They also are not able to retrieve information. So if you're taking a test and feeling overwhelmingly anxious, that's why sometimes those kids that you know, if you've talked to them, they know everything, and then they on a test just bomb it. Sometimes they really aren't able to retrieve that information. Oh, I forgot to mention something about the fight, flight, or freeze. Sometimes flight, it's related to this, is why I'm telling you this now, but sometimes flight is falling asleep. Sometimes those kids who are falling asleep are in an anxious state, and anxious kids, one, they use going to sleep to escape. They will literally take a nap to get away from everything, and it's the big emotions. And we've probably all known people, or maybe you are a person like this. When you experience something really big, you're like exhausted and like immediately need to go take a nap. It's so like, I know people who say like, yeah, I got in a fight and I had to go straight to bed and take a nap. So that's sort of sometimes the way people process those big emotions. It's also that our anxious kids are sleep deprived. They tend to be, they don't sleep well. Their worries keep them from sleeping well. Their worries wake them up early because they're worried about, what the day might hold. So anxious kids are sleep deprived. So going back to what I was saying about, their learning ability, and the fact that if you're anxious, and especially in an anxious state, all of the other parts of our brain are not doing as well. And sleep deprivation on top of that doesn't help things. So in a nutshell, what's happening with the rest of our brain is it's just not working the way it's supposed to when you're actually in an anxious state. So it's a vicious circle. Anxiety is going to affect the way they behave at school and at home. It affects their ability to participate, which affects their ability to learn and to do the things you're asking them to do, which then is going to affect their behavior, which then is going to affect their ability to participate in class. So you can see how this can really turn into a vicious cycle. So before I talk about things you can do, because my goal in this entire class is to give you at least 2 or 3 things that are super basic, super easy, you can walk away and use tomorrow. And I am going to do that, but before I do, I'm going to stop share for a second. I'm going to look at the chat, make sure there's no questions. If anybody has a question, you can type it in the chat real quick, or feel free to unmute yourself and tell me. And I'm just going to tell you, because I didn't at the beginning, who I am and why I do this work. So I don't know if you noticed, but on the very first slide, it does say PhD. I do have a PhD. I am also a certified life coach. But the reason that I talk about children with anxiety is because I am a parent of a child with anxiety. So when I say I've had firsthand knowledge, I truly have firsthand knowledge of what it is like to have a child that struggles with anxiety and struggles with all the kinds of things I was saying. Now, have not witnessed my own child in a classroom setting, but when I was teaching in a setting where I was teaching in a place where children who struggle in typical classroom settings, this is where I was teaching, at a place where we would try and adapt for them. So all of my students struggled with anxiety. So I've seen it in the classroom setting, but I also have seen it in my home and seen how it evolves and happens. And I also coach parents of anxious children. So that's kind of a misconception a lot of people have about what I do. They think I work with the kids, and I do not work with kids. I work with parents. So a lot of the things that I will share with you in terms of tips are similar to the tips that I would share with my clients when I'm helping them manage their children's anxiety. So let's go back to sharing my screen. Some of you on this, I see some names, like I said hi to Miss Rawson at the beginning. Some of you know these precious children who are not little babies anymore, but are big kids. But I put their picture on this slide because I always like people to know that my why is really not about my education or life coaching or any of that stuff. It's my why is really about helping parents just like me who struggled, and in my personal experience, who did things wrong a whole lot. I'm very, very upfront and open about the fact that I screwed up a lot. I learned some hard lessons about things I did wrong. And so my mission is really to help parents do it better than I did, in all honesty. So with that being said, now you know who I am and why I even talk about this. Let's talk about things you can do in the classroom tomorrow, or when school starts, or even on a Zoom call that can help. So tip number 1 is to help your students befriend their anxiety, because it's not going away. As I said, it is something we all experience. So there's a couple ways to do this. One is, as I said at the very beginning, I make it a point every time I talk to a group of teenagers especially, I make a point of saying, anxiety is normal. It's a normal part of being human. Yes, it's terrible. Yes, it can ruin some really good things, and it has for probably everyone, but it's also normal, because what we don't want is our kids walking around convinced something is terribly wrong with them. We want them to know that this is a normal thing. We kind of want, one of the best phrases that I use as a coach and as a mom and just as a human being is, I like to live my life in yes and. Everything is a yes and. Because we typically, as human beings, we like to make things yes, period, or this or that. And what I think is very helpful when we talk about anxiety, and actually when we talk about a whole lot of things, if you think about it, but really with anxiety, yes and. I struggle with anxiety. I have an anxiety disorder. Yes, and anxiety is absolutely normal. It's a normal thing. And anxiety is actually a gift, that if right now my house caught on fire and I needed to save myself, all of my smart brain that wants to think and process and plan and talk about, well, maybe I should go get that rug on my way out is that, oh, but I could probably get another rug. No, with that blue and that rug is very hard to match. Maybe I should. That is not helpful. The house is on fire. What needs to happen is the part of my brain that says, Tonya, you're in danger. You can't fight that fire. You can't freeze in place. So fly is the answer. I'm going to shut down all your systems so that all you're doing is go run out of the house before you burn down with it. That's a gift. When that part of you, when you're walking along and you see the dark alley and a part of you says, I don't think I'm going to go down that dark alley. It makes me a little uncomfortable. I'm feeling some bad feelings. I'm going to skip that dark alley. Gift. Our ancestors were able to become our ancestors because they ran away when they saw those Viking ships coming towards the shore, or they saw the person who looked sick with the plague and said, I don't want any part of that. I'm going. Or they, ran from the hungry tiger or hid from the hungry tiger. Those were all things that kept us alive. So anxiety is our friend. And here's another really important thing when it comes to the classroom. There's this really interesting study I read about anxiety. And this is something that you guys can tell your students, because anxiety and performance is like a upside down U. It looks like a big hill. So as your anxiety creeps up, when you need to take a test or when I needed to do this webinar, there is a certain amount of anxiety that is going to make you perform better. Again, anxiety is our friend. Anxiety is a gift. When I start feeling anxious feelings and say, well, I better prepare, I better rehearse one more time, I better study, those feelings help us perform better. Now there is a point at which anxiety becomes too much and we start going down that hill and our performance declines. So we don't want to get over that. But there is a point at which anxiety is our friend and is helping us do better at lots of things. Speaking in front of people, taking tests. And there was this really cool study where they took two groups of kids and they did nothing differently with these two groups of kids, except they told one group, anxiety, if you feel anxious, that actually will help you perform better. So when you feel a little anxious when you take this test, that's okay, because a little bit of anxiety is a good thing. It makes you perform better. Only difference between those two groups. The group who was told that performed better than the group who wasn't told. My theory is that the group who was told anxiety helps you perform better, when they felt anxious, it kind of became a self-fulfilling prophecy and they didn't let it overwhelm them. The kids who had not been told this actually is a good thing, it can help you, panicked when they felt anxious, as we often do. And anxiety can become a negative feedback loop. So these kids started thinking, oh no, I'm feeling anxious. I hope this doesn't make me mess up. I'm going to be so anxious. I'm not going to do well on the test. This is going to mess. So that kind of thinking actually is very harmful to how well they performed. But the thinking, oh, I feel a little anxious. This actually might help me. This is probably a good thing. Totally different story, same feeling. So just by telling your kids a little bit of anxiety is a good thing, helps them perform better, helps them embrace it, helps them know, again, it's normal, it can be a gift, it can be your friend. So tip number one, help them befriend their anxiety. Tip number two is brain hacks. And brain hacks, there's like this one basic brain hack that we all know, we've all been told a million times, it's kind of a cliche, and that is to breathe. And if you have tried that, if you have tried to tell an anxious child, a student or your own child, just breathe, you have found that it does not work. And I will tell you why. There's two sides of this. So they need two things. One, you can't teach someone what to do when they're anxious for all the reasons we explained earlier about the brain. they're not taking in information. Their executive functioning is shut down. Their ability to process and just absorb what you're saying does not work when they are anxious. So if they're in an anxious state and you're trying to teach them a skill or convince them of something, they are not in a receptive place to hear you. The other reason that telling someone to breathe typically does not work is that they are already breathing. We're always breathing. So they discount that. We all kind of discount it. So the way to get an anxious child, or any child, all of your children who are going to experience anxiety, to use the best, easiest brain hack, which is to breathe, is to explain why it works and to do that when they are not anxious. And even better, to practice it when they are not anxious. So here's why it works. I've explained all that cool stuff about the amygdala and the amygdala having all this power over our entire body. And there's another really cool thing about there's a lot of other cool things about our bodies. I could go on and on about all the fun, amazing messages our bodies are sending to us all the time. But one amazing thing we've got is a feedback loop. And it's a feedback loop from our lungs to our brain. Because as human beings, if you think about it, if you go without water, you live for a couple of days. If you go without food, you'll live for a couple of weeks. If you go without oxygen, you are not going to live very long at all. It's minutes. So oxygen is one of the most important things. So our brain, our body has a very sophisticated system to say, if you're not getting oxygen, you need to do something really quickly because you don't have a lot of time. However, our lungs can signal back up to our brain. So when we can take long, slow, deep breaths, and that's the way you need to say it to your students, long, slow, deep breaths, your lungs will send a message right back up to your brain that's starting to panic and is starting to feel anxious and say, hey, it's okay. I've got lots of oxygen. You don't need to worry. So it actually is a physiological thing that's going on. There's also a psychological thing that goes on, which is when we want to, a lot of times our anxiety is rooted in thinking that we're having some anxious thoughts. I'm going to fail this test. I knew I was going to fail this test. I might fail this test. And that triggers in our brain an experience like we're about to be eaten by a lion. We act like failing a chemistry test is the same as being eaten by a lion. It's not true, but our brain doesn't know it's not true. And so when we stop for a second and kind of get out of that thought and say, I'm just going to focus on my breath for a second, we're stepping away from those cycling thoughts that are causing anxiety. So two important things will happen when your students who are feeling anxious can actually take those long, slow, deep breaths. They will stop thinking their thoughts that are making them anxious, and they actually will physiologically give a signal to their brain to calm down. It's okay. You don't need to panic right now. So depending on the age of your kids, you can make it as silly and as fun as, like, let's practice breathing all the way down to our toes. Feel that breath all the way in our toes. And now let's feel breath all the way in our fingers. And now can you breathe and have it come out of your ears? Can you have it come out of the top of your head? Just be silly with getting breaths. I want you to feel it in your belly. Feel your air going into your belly. So teaching them, and I'm going to count. We're going to count to 5 on our inhale. We're going to count to 5 on our exhale. So little kids are so happy to do stuff like this with you. That's one of the beauties of your young kids. Your older kids do not do what you say. They do what you do. So what I recommend my parent clients is to model this, to say to them, to say to your teenagers and even your preteens who are getting too cool for school, if you say, you know what, I'm feeling a little anxious right now, I'm going to take some breaths. Just hold on a second. I'm going to count out loud while I do it. I need to take these really deep breaths. I'm going to breathe in. I'm going to count to 5. I'm going to breathe out. I'm going to count to 5. I'm going to do this 3 times because this really helps me when I'm feeling anxious. That is enough right there for it to make a little mental note in that kid's head. I wonder if that works. She seems to think that works. Maybe when I'm feeling anxious, I might try that. That tends to, bigger kids tend to be a lot more open to those sorts of teachings than when you are feeling anxious, this is what you should do. There's no harm in going through a little exercise and explaining that to them too, but I find doing both is probably the sweet spot. Modeling some good anxiety management. And it doesn't even have to be breath. I recommend modeling all kinds of stuff. With the little kids, to say, I'm feeling a little anxious. Miss Crombie's feeling a little anxious right now. Y'all want to stand up and we're going to wiggle. We're going to get our wiggles out because that helps me feel less anxious. Every time you say that, you're saying, hey guys, feeling anxious is normal. Even Miss Crombie feels anxious sometimes. And I don't freak out about it. I don't feel bad about myself. But I do have some things that I can do to help me. So modeling is really the key. And that is actually leads us right into my last tip, which is self-compassion. This one is probably, the meatiest tip I've got, because self-compassion encompasses so much stuff, but at the same time, it is so important and so impactful. And let me tell you why. There was a study done by, the self-compassion researchers out there. They looked at combat veterans. So just imagine for a second where combat veterans are people who have experienced, if you want to look for stress and anxiety and trauma, that's a group to look at. They experience really horrible things. And what they found when they looked at, they're trying to predict who's going to get PTSD. And they found that the people who were able to practice self-compassion, that was a better predictor of not experiencing PTSD than exposure to combat. So that to me was like mind-blowing, really, to think about that. You would assume that the more combat you experience, the more traumatic experiences, that's going to predict if you have PTSD. And actually what they found was it is what you are saying to yourself. So what is happening with our anxious kids is they are saying things to themselves that are traumatizing themselves all the time. So it's kind of the same principle as what I just said with the, yes, we need to teach them, like tell them that story, the older ones especially, tell them. There's research that says, so because that really hits home, like this is a real thing, this really matters, what I'm saying in my head matters. But we also have to model it, and I think we have to model it for them from the time they're tiny to the time they're big. They need to know. So it's almost like your inner dialogue. Say your inner dialogue out loud. That's how I recommend modeling it, and how I sometimes do model it at my own house. I will say things like, you know what, I did a webinar today and I don't even think it was that good, and I was kind of beating myself up about it. So I've decided that I'm not going to focus on what I didn't do well, and I sat down and I came up with 5 things that I did great today. You want to hear 5 things that I think I did great today? And, just that kind of conversation. And then say, tell me 5 things you did great today. Was there anything that you were saying to yourself that you shouldn't say to yourself? Those are the kind of conversations you can have, but modeling practicing self-compassion, talking about how important it is to practice self-compassion. It's the key. It's the key to happiness. It's the key to, managing our anxiety. It's the key to not traumatizing ourselves more and more. It's, like I said, it's a big topic. I could spend a whole webinar on each one of these tips, but I wanted to give you enough, like I said, that you could walk away and use some of this stuff tomorrow if you want to with your students, no matter whether they're little bitties or they're the big kids. So with all of that being said, those are kind of my 3 tips that I'd love for you to try. I want to give you 3 kind of caveats or things to remember as you're going out into the world to try and do this stuff. So the first thing to remember is anxiety is not something your kids can just snap out of. And sometimes we think we can say that, or we can talk them out of it. We can say, well, just don't think that anymore. And unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. I don't know if I said this earlier, but when I was talking about that whole, the research study where anxiety and performance, and I said the reason why the kids who did not know that anxiety helped their performance did worse is because they went into a negative feedback loop. The phrase, what we resist persists, is a thing that I say all the time with people. And it's so true about anxiety. When we try to resist it, when we try and tell ourselves, don't feel that way, or you're stupid for feeling this way, or you have no reason to feel this way, that's just negative self-talk. That's the opposite of self-compassion, and it is making anxiety worse. So it's not something they can snap out of. It's something you have to learn how to accept, know it's normal, be friends with it, have some brain hacks, and truly be compassionate with yourself. It's also super tricky because it looks like so many other things. It looks like just bad kids sometimes. Your angry, disruptive kid might be struggling with anxiety. That kid who seems like they don't listen to you and are being, disrespectful because they're drawing while you're talking, they might be struggling with anxiety. That kid that went to the bathroom and didn't come back for 15 minutes, they might be struggling with anxiety. So it's, sometimes I think we make assumptions that people are doing things, especially kids. We assume they're doing it on purpose, or they're faking it, or they're just trying to get attention. And sometimes that may be true, but sometimes it isn't. And what I find, my own personal rule of thumb, when I can, because I'm not a saint, but when I can, if I can just give the benefit of the doubt and say, maybe, this kid seems like he's being a complete jerk right now, but maybe he's feeling anxious. And sometimes I have to do that and give that kind of grace with the children who come home to my house in the afternoons. They are complete jerks. And sometimes I realize that they have had all they could deal with, that the day has taken it out of them, that they may have had social drama, there may have been something said at the lunch table, they may have a test, they may feel like they're going to fail. They are overwhelmed, and the way it's coming out is fight. And the person that's easiest to fight with is their mother. And you just have to give them some grace. And the last most important thing for you guys, and I say this, I'm laughing because it's like I wrote this and I'm actually like almost tearing up as I'm saying it now, because there are so many people on here. Some of you are like, people who this is true about, that I know from personal experience. Like, you have so much impact. You are some of the people on here taught my own kids, and you guys have had so much impact on my kids. They are with you all day. So these little brain hacks that I'm talking about, and these times that you give that kid a little grace, or that you notice, that's the other thing that teachers do every single day. And you guys are just like rock stars for what you do. When you notice that kid who seems off and you say something to them, you can change the trajectory of a kid's life with a one conversation that time that you say, hey, what's up? You don't seem okay. Is everything okay? I care about you. I noticed. It's so big and so huge. And I am in awe at what you guys do every single day, because you're teachers. And that's a very specific skill set and a very important skill set. But at the same time, you have to do all this other stuff. You are the mental health, you're frontline mental health people. You really are. You are the reason why so many of us know that our children had struggles, because you were the ones who saw it first and you pointed it out to us. So you have a huge impact. I'm in awe. I thank you all. Um, if if you would want to reach me for any reason, my website address is guidanceforthefuture.com, and you can email me directly at Tonya@guidanceforthefuture.com. So that is my whole slideshow. I am going to end the share, and just, if any of you guys have any specific thought, comment, question, as I said, this is real informal. Feel free to unmute yourself and just say something, or pop it in the chat, and I'd be happy to answer if I can. Thank you guys. Somebody just said thank you for guys, thank you so much. Like, normally I speak to parents, as you said, but like, truly, you guys are my heroes. So I'm so glad that you're here. The reason that I especially call you my heroes is because you guys showed up to do this today. So if you're like phoning it in, you certainly wouldn't be taking time out of your summer to just come here and listen to me go on and on about the brain and anxiety and blah, blah, blah. So you guys are awesome, every single one of you, probably the best teachers in the whole world. So yeah, you have my email address. You have, I think most of you, when you registered for this, you automatically get kicked onto my mailing list. So you'll get things from me. A lot of it is geared towards parents, not teachers. I do have a lot of teachers on my list. So I try and do a little bit of both, but it's more parents. So if you feel like this is not for you and you unsubscribe, you will not hurt my feelings. But if you stick around, I will try and do more stuff like this for you guys. And if you ever say like, hey, I'd love to hear about this, or I want to offer this to our PTO, or I want to offer this to another group of teachers, just send me an email. I would do this all day, every day, truly. So thank you guys so much for being here, and you know how to reach me.